Recently in the new Commander Master set, we got Red Return and Lotless Giant spoiled as commons in that set. This means a lot for Pauper. It opens a lot in terms of brewing space. So I wanted to make a video kind of talking about some of the areas that these might be impactful in, and kind of offer some insight into some fringe archetypes that don't really have a lot of resources going for them. So this video is going to primarily focus on the history of Dread Return, specifically in formats like Legacy, where it has seen play, and what this would mean for Pauper. Additionally, it's going to be talking about some of the Pauper decks that are already existing, where this might see some play in. Without further ado, let's talk about what these cards are, and where they typically see play. So the first card here is Dread Return. So this is a 4-mana sorcery that says you can return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can also cast it from the graveyard by paying /bat cost of sacrificing 3 creatures, so you don't need any mana, you just have to sacrifice 3 creatures, and you can then put a creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield. Now, typically, this is combined with cards like Narcomoeba, which when put into your graveyard from your library, you can put them directly onto the battlefield. So these 2 cards, when you mill your deck, you get the Narcomoeba for the Dread Return, and then you can cast Dread Return, and typically you end up casting Thassa's Oracle. Right? That's the card that you're going to target with it, you put this into play, and then you win the game on the spot. However, for a while, Thassa's Oracle was not lethal, and so the best option was the card Lotless Giant. Now, Lotless Giant has seen play in the past in Legacy, and it's important to kind of reference some of these older lists to get an idea of how the card was used and how these decks were built. So the first card here, or rather the first deck here that might apply to Pauper is the Balustrade Spy or Oops All Spells build. So this is an older version from before we got things like Thassa's Oracle and the Sun our Flip lands and things like that. So it's definitely not up to date with the current build of the deck, but this deck had a similar idea of cast the card Balustrade Spy or Undercity Informer, which is not lethal in Pauper, and mill your deck. And then once you mill your deck, because you're going to target yourself, you'll mill over the 3 Narcomoebas. You're then going to use those to flashback Dread Return, and then with Lotless Giant, you win the game on the spot, and you deal 29 damage, or roughly 29 damage, a little bit less, because this will be in play, and you might have a Narcomoeba or a Spy in play, but roughly 20-something damage to heal your opponent. And you ideally wanted this all to happen on the very first turn. Another deck that used these 2 cards in conjunction with one another was Cephalid Breakfast. This uses the card Nomad's Abhor combined with Cephalid Illusionist to essentially mill the entire library. Cephalid Illusionist, when it becomes the target of a spell or ability, causes you to mill 3 cards, and Nomad's Abhor can target it over and over to mill your deck. You also have Shuko, which can target it with the equip ability over and over again. Then you use the card Dread Return combined with Narcomoeba and Lotless Giant to win the game. Notice we are playing a lot of creatures in this build. With that being said, we kind of have an understanding of how this was used in Eternal formats before the printing of cards like Thassa's Oracle, and the big takeaway here was that it used a lot of creature cards for it to work. With that being said, how can this be used in Pauper? Well, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is One Land Spy. One Land Spy uses the card Balustrade Spy to mill the deck and essentially win the game from there. I want to take a look at one of the older builds on this deck from 2016, 2018, around that era. There's no attaching Chrome in this list, which was lethal around that time, but the general game plan and strategy in this build is more or less the same from that era. So with that being said, let's kind of talk about how this build on the deck works. Notice we aren't playing a land in this deck, so we have to find a way to get this land out of our deck. We use cards like Land Grant in conjunction with Wirewood Guardian to fetch the 1 forest out of our deck and then put it into our hand. Once it's in our hand, we can play it, and then ideally, we want to start, casting a Balustrade Spy. Now, if it's not in our hand, we have to wait to draw it, or we can find it off of a Dimir House card or Immune with Nature, but ideally, we want to find our Balustrade Spy. Once we found it, we can then use cards like Dark Ritual, Tinderwall, Simian Spirit Guide, Metamorphose, and Wild Cantor to help us cast our Balustrade Spy from our hand. Once we cast the Balustrade Spy, we're then going to target ourselves and mill our entire library. That's the second step. The third step is ideally we want to have 1 black mana left over. That 1 black mana will then be used to cast Songs of the Damned. It's also important to note that if you do not have Songs of the Damned in your hand, but you have Haunter's Bauble either in play or in your hand, you can use this to target Songs of the Damned to put it into your hand. The reason being is that Haunter's Bauble puts a card on the bottom of your library, but because you have no library, it essentially just goes into your deck and then you draw it immediately off of the draw trigger on Haunter's Bauble. So, to reiterate, you get the Forest, you cast Spy, and then you cast Songs of the Damned. Great, you have a ton of black mana, what next? Well, you cast Mort Theft, and then you're going to cast 2 of these. The first one is going to target Anarchist, and the second one is going to target Simian Spirit Guide. You're going to exile Simian Spirit Guide to cast Anarchist, and Anarchist will then target Haunting Misery. You will then cast this, exiling all the creatures from your graveyard to deal roughly 20 damage to your opponent. Now, the problem with this is that you're not really able to deal that much damage in this build. In fact, if your opponent gains even a little bit of life, you might not be able to kill them. You have a fixed amount of damage that you can do in this build. So there's some limitations. And I also want to stress that early builds of One Land Spy were considered a meme, and they were not taken that seriously, and this was for good reason. The deck kind of lacked a lot of different tools, and it wasn't very good, but it was a very cool deck, and it was kind of a fun and fringe archetype in the format. In 2022, I worked on this deck with a friend of mine, Balustrade, and he was the first person to 5-0 with this deck. Now, we made some changes to the archetype, but the archetype also got some recent upgrades. The main one being the fact that we got dual lands in Pauper that happen to have the Forest and Swamp subtype. We got these for all 10 dual lands, and that was pretty important, because now our land grant got us a Black Source. So, that's kind of important, whereas before you typically needed a Lotus Petal or a Wild Cantor as your starting Black Source. However, nowadays, you can now use cards like Land Grant to just get it immediately. You also could use cards like Metamorphose, but regardless, you still needed some way to get that initial black mana to start the combo. This build heals a little bit differently. If you notice, we're not playing Haunting Misery. The reason being is that Haunting Misery can only deal a fixed amount of damage before your opponent dies. So if they gain a little bit of life, or if they use cards like Prismatic Strands, you're not able to kill them anymore. So that's kind of a drawback on the card Haunting Misery. So what does this build do? Well, it heals in a slightly different fashion. Let's talk about how that works. So, step 1, get that Forest out of your deck and put it into play. Step number 2, cast Balustrade Spy. Step number 3, cast Songs of the Damned. It's the same setup as before. Now, you're going to have a couple different lines. I want to also stress that in addition to Balustrade Spy, we're also playing the card Destroy the Evidence. This is a 5-mana version of Balustrade Spy, where you would target your own land and blow it up, so that way you get the mill effect that comes with Balustrade Spy. This just happens to come on the card Destroy the Evidence. So there's 2 different lines depending on what you use, whether it's Destroy the Evidence or Balustrade Spy. I'm going to talk about the first one with Balustrade Spy. So you're going to mill yourself with Balustrade Spy, and then you're going to flashback the Mort Theft, and you're going to target the Dimir House card. You're then going to cast the Dimir House card, and then use the Sacrifice ability to sacrifice the Balustrade Spy that is in play. This will then trigger the Grim Harvest that is in your graveyard, and you will pay the recover cost. Once you pay that, it will be in your hand, and you will cast it targeting Mirror Retriever. You will then cast Mirror Retriever, and set it to the Dimir House Urn. When you set it, you will treat your Rim Harvest again, and you will pay the recover cost. When Mirror Prima dies, it will return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand, and that will be Hunter's Bauble. You will then use Bauble to get back Songs of the Damned. You will then use this loop on Dimir House Urn, Rim Harvest, Mirror Prima, Hunter's Bauble, and Songs of the Damned to generate infinite black mana. Awesome. Once you have infinite black mana, you will then, instead of targeting Mirror Prima with Rim Harvest, you will then target Balustrade Spy. This will then target your opponent this time instead of yourself, and you will repeat this process over and over again until you mill your opponent. You can also do a lot of different things with the Hunter's Bauble. You can target to destroy the evidence over and over again to essentially destroy all of your opponent's lands and mill their debt. Another thing that you can do is you can hard cast Granite Stinger off of Lotus Metal, and then you can cycle Sweet Wraith and Granite Healer to deal your opponent damage. So you also have a damage-based win condition as well. In fact, you can deal quite a bit of damage, because what you can do is you can hard cast Cinderwall, Wild Handsor, Mirror Framer, Pit Heaper, Simian Spirit Guide, all your Balustrade Spies, and put them all into play. And then what you can do is keep the Granite Healer and Sweet Wraiths in hand, and at this point, remember, we have infinite mana of every color, because we have infinite Lotus Metals off of Baubles, and infinite Songs of the Damned off of Baubles as well. So with those two things combined, off of the initial Mirror Prima mana loop, we have infinite mana of every color, so that's how we're able to cast all our spells. Once we've done that, and we cast everything, what we can do is we can cycle a Granite Healer off of our infinite mana, and deal 4 damage to our opponent off of the 4 Granite Stingers that are in play. What we can then do from there is, when that's in the graveyard, we can cast Rim Harvest from hand to return it to our hand. Then what we can do is we can sacrifice one of the creatures, the many creatures that we put into play, and that will create a Rim Harvest. We can then use the Rim Harvest ability to recover, put it back to our hand, and then with the cycle trigger on the stat, we can return it to our hand and do it all again. So not only do we have 4 damage for every Sweet Wraith and Granite Healer, which in this case is 7 times 4, which is 28, not only do we have 28 damage already just off the cyclers themselves, but we have even more damage out of all the other creatures that we're going to play and set to create a Rim Harvest to get back our cyclers. So this will deal a lot of damage. That's another line that you can take. Now I also want to stress that what happens if instead of casting Balustrade Spy, you have to destroy the evidence? If you notice, we're not going to have a creature in play to sacrifice to the Dimir House Guard. So what do we do then? Well, what you do is when you pass Mort Death, you target Pit Heaper. This will then trigger and return the Dimir House Guard, which you will then cast and set the Pit Heaper to start the chain all over again. So that was how this deck won, in either one via infinite mill or infinite damage. Now, this was able to beat Life Gain, however, one of the drawbacks was that sometimes a well-placed removal spell could cause disaster. However, we were still able to 5-0 with this build, and it was the very first one to 5-0 with the Balustrade Spy combo in Pauper. Since then, we've gotten a number of new additions to Pauper, and I want to talk about those right now. So, the first build is one that I have been working on about, within this past month of recording. So, one of the ideas that I had for this build was I noticed that the original builds of Spy were kind of clunky, in that if we look at this original build here, right, one of the issues that Spy always had was that you didn't really have a lot of card selection. You kind of needed everything to come together, and that's asking a lot. Now, one of the things that we weren't able to do in this build was we were able to play Granite Stinger, Sweet Wraith, and Granite Healer to have some cycling to kind of thin our deck and draw what we need. So we didn't have a ton of bricks, but still, the card velocity in this build was pretty low, all things considered, and it wasn't that good. So one of the ideas that I had was to play a build that had the same, win conditions. However, this one had infinite damage outright because you can just continuously cycle Generous End. So what you can do is you can get all your cyclers in your hand off of Bubble, and then you can just repeatedly cycle them, and you never have to worry about milling out. So you essentially have infinite damage that way, but you still have the infinite mill that you had before. One of the things that's also important to note, by the way, is that there's another reason we play Dimir House Urn, which is that you can transmute it to find your Balustrade Spy. So not only is it a combo piece for the first half of your combo, but it is a combo piece for the second half. Now, I want to stress that one of the big additions, and the reason why I wanted to try this build, is the land cyclers from Lord of the Rings. So Generous End and Philip Has a Doom. These are 1 mana cyclers that either in a swamp or a forest. So the reason why we care about these so much is that we never had 1 mana colorless, or rather 1 generic mana cyclers before that were creatures, right? We've never had those before in Pauper. And that's a really big deal, because in order for this, combo to work, Sons of the Damned has to generate enough mana for you to go through the lines. Because if you notice, the lines of Flashing Bat, Mort Theft, and all that requires a lot of mana. So if you're not playing a critical number of creatures, you're not going to have enough mana to do the second half of that combo. With that being said, not only are these creatures for the critical number of creatures that you need, but they also help get lands out of your deck. So why don't we decide to play more lands than we have been playing before? This is not only beneficial because we don't have to play a ton of things like Simian Spirit Guide, Tinderwall, and all that, but they also happen to thin our deck, and they also help free up slots to maybe play cards like Duress, which can help fight through counter magic, and maybe get rid of removal spells that would interact with our combo. Another thing that's important to note is that Mort Theft is no longer the best version of itself. There's a better card in Crawl from the Cellar, which is identical, but it costs less mana. So that's just something to keep in mind. It wasn't legal in the original build that we 5-0'd with. It wasn't a card that existed yet. But since then, it has been printed, and so it is better. But if you notice, this particular build is more or less identical to the previous one. We're just playing more lands, and we're playing cards like Abundant Harvest to help find lands from our deck that can also be cycled later on. One of the things that I like about this build is that it has a lot of early cyclers. So you have Durana Stinger, you have Horror of the Broken Lands, you have Street Wraith, you have the creature cyclers here, you have Abundant Harvest which can cycle later on. You even have Crawl from the Cellar, which can grab a cycler just to help keep drawing through your deck. So you have a lot of ways to essentially get the lands out of your deck, cycle through your deck to find combo pieces like Balustrade Spy, Dark Ritual, Protection like Duress, and then once you're ready to go, you can kill the opponent. I've done well with this in leagues. In fact, I feel like it's one of the more competitive builds of Spy that I have played in my life, and I've gone 3-2 and 4-1 respectively. I have not 5-0'd with it, but for what it's worth, in the current metagame that we have with cards like Swiss Spear, the Initiative, things that were not around during the original 5-0, the fact that it's able to compete with that stuff is somewhat impressive nonetheless. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But before we got the new spoilers, this is what I was working on. Another build that I was working on, which I'll talk about in a second, was trying to play Exhume with the land cyclers. Now, I was playing this before we got the Lot-Lit Giant, but it was something that was interesting to do, because you have a plan B of, hey, I'm just going to Exhume a fatty, but also you can randomly combo kill your opponent with Balustrade Spy. Not to mention that Exhume could also randomly work with Balustrade Spy, in the sense that if your opponent countered it, later on you can try to get it back with Exhume, so it served as more copies of Balustrade Spy, which was beneficial. With that being said, this deck overall was enhanced by the addition of Lot-Lit Giant. We no longer have to play cards like Mirror Retriever or anything like that, because one thing we could do with this particular build is you can mill yourself, and then cast Sons, cast Crawl from the Cellar from the graveyard, and then just hard cast Lot-Lit Giant. Now, the problem with this build is that if you notice we're playing very few creatures, only 23. So we're kind of fixed on the mana, or rather the damage that we can do because of the number of creatures that we have with Lot-Lit Giant. However, maybe this build can be adjusted to have more creatures and, fight that possible angle attack. It's also possible that in the sideboard, maybe we make different decisions as a result. So we have different options that we could do there as a result. Another build is a Dread Return build. So you could also play Dread Return in Spy. You can play it in a 1-land build, you can also play it in a 4-land build. It's just another angle attack. However, you notice we do not have Narcomoeba in this format. But we do have another angle of attack. What you can do is you can cast Sons of the Damned, and then what you can do is you can unearth and Dreadscape Zombie to get creatures in play, which you can then sacrifice for Dread Returns to target the Lotless Giant. However, once again, you are limited on the amount of damage that you can do with this, and there is a damage cap. If you notice, one of the issues with all of these different angles of attack with Dread Return into Lotless Giant is that you are still capped on the amount of damage that you can do. As a result, it does make me wonder if this is really something that Spy can benefit from, because in these builds that are all in on the Spy combo, if your opponent has a card like Weather the Storm, or Pulsa Marasa, or Reckoner's Bargain on a Mirror Enforcer, right, or any other ways they can gain life due to the fact that burn is very present in this format, it might not be the best angle of attack to be your primary game plan. One other angle of attack that you can do is you can instead play it with Reaping the Graves and try to play Songs of the Damned and things like that. This, if you notice, we play a very high creature count, 37 creatures to be exact, so a light game spell here or there might not be problematic, but we also still have the game plan of Grana Stinger for a ton of damage as well. So this is a build that I worked on, and the general idea is that what you can do is early on, you can cycle your land cyclers to get lands out of your deck, and then you can start comboing, Reaping the Graves and all that, but then randomly you can just, out of nowhere, cast Spy, mill yourself, and then draw from the cellar mat the Giant, and then deal your opponent a ton of damage. So you ought to have both angles of attack in this deck. This is another angle that I've been interested in testing with, I've been interested in trying it, and we'll have to see where it goes. But to recap, for Balustrade Spy, in all its, in all of its glory, I think that there's a couple different angles of attack. There is the one-land Spy build, which I think is questionable and still kind of a meme. There is a build that decides to play more lands, not a ton, but a little bit more, in conjunction with land cyclers and effects like Exhume. There's the similar idea where you just decide to not play the Lotless Giant at all, and instead try to rely on the Mirror Cleaver loop. And then there's the build where you decide to just play Dread Return and Dreadscape Zombie. You can do this with either one land or 4 lands. The thing that's interesting to note about all of this is that Dread Return is not explicitly required for this combo to work. One of the benefits of Dread Return is that you technically don't need Songs of the Damned. If you cast a Spy and then have 2 black mana floating, you can return 2 Dreadscape Zombies from the battlefield, or from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then you can cast Dread Return. So you don't need a ton of mana that you would otherwise. However, you still run into the problem of, if your opponent gains enough life, or if they use a damage prevention spell like Prismatic Strands, you can't win. So that's a bit of a drawback when you are attacking from this angle. The point is that there's no angle that is 100%, but there are some interesting angles of attack. It's also important to address that maybe you shouldn't be playing just one land. Maybe you shouldn't be playing more lands now that we have the land cyclers. It's also a possible angle of attack to fight cards like Exhume to give this deck a plan B. That's all I have to talk about when it comes to Spy and Pauper and all of its possible applications. The takeaway here that I want to stress is that this is kind of an unexplored area in Pauper. I think people oftentimes dismiss it as a meme, but I do think that there is something here. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is Cephalid Breakfast. So, Cephalid Illusionist is not legal in Pauper, however, Cephalid Aristocrat, a 5-mana equivalent, is legal in Pauper. So Cephalid Aristocrat, in combination with Nomad's Core, allows you to mill your deck. We can combine this with cards like Sacred Cat, which we can embalm from our graveyard, or even things like Battle Screens to create tokens from our graveyard, to essentially give us enough creatures to sacrifice to Dread Return, which can then be used to cast Lotless Giant. The problem with this is that we need to play a heavy creature count, and in this particular build, I don't have enough right now, so this would need some adjustment. One thing that I've seen people try is they combine it with Basilisk Gate to have a plan A of trying to attack your opponent with these kind of dorky creatures, but they can also have a plan B of Cephalid Aristocrat combo kill with Dread Return. This is something that I've been working on even before we had these spoilers, but I was never able to make it work. One thing that you could do to kind of help speed up the combo, because once again, a 5-drop is very expensive for present-day Pauper standards, is combine it with things like Dark Ritual or Exhume. You can put it in the graveyard with things like Careful Study or the Modern Age, which is then combo with Exhume, or you can also play the Land Cyclers to maybe in Exhume other options as well. You can also have cards like Prismatic Strand as well. The options are kind of limited, but still, you have lots of different interesting choices, so it's interesting to see where this will go. Another angle attack you could do is to play 80 cards and try like a Yorion idea without Yorion, right? Maybe that's an option. Who knows? But this is another angle attack that is worth exploring. With that being said, I hope that you have enjoyed the showcase of possible angles of attack of Dread Return and Lotless Giant and Pauper. I'm interested to see where these cards will go. My 2 cents is that right now Lotless Giant will certainly be impactful, but I think Dread Return has limited applications. I think the card is good, but right now I don't see it doing anything that we aren't already capable of. It might have some interesting angles of attack in things like Reanimator, with cards like Exhume. Reanimator has always wanted another reanimation spell, and this is the best one we have in addition to Exhume, so it might see play there. And it's also, maybe it might create a new archetype in Cephalid Breakfast. However, I think right now it's not going to have any insane impacts. But what I want to stress is that I believe that cards like Balustrade Spy and Dread Return are cards that will only get better as time goes on. And who knows, maybe one day they might end up on the Pauper ban list. Only time will tell. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.